But first, when governments get into political trouble, the lesson for those that want to survive is that they just can't wallow in it. Governments that don't know how to cut their losses or change the subject, preferably by getting on with something that will rally their support base, they are usually then in terminal decay. For several weeks now, both the New South Wales and Queensland governments have been bogged down in self-created crises that never should have happened in the first place and that should have been resolved almost as soon as they became apparent. Take Queensland. Deputy Premier Jackie Trad should not have failed to declare her husband's property purchase, related as it was to political decisions on her desk. Nor should she have called the head of the Crime and Corruption Commission, the bloke whose job it is to ensure integrity in circumstances just like this. Across the corridor in the Premier's office, her Chief of Staff should not have been running a business on the side, nor should that business, while he was an investor, have been angling for a taxpayer grant. Perception is reality in politics, and the Palaszczuk government is in a world of pain because it has not politically managed these issues. From the outset, Trad should have been stood down until the Commission reported, and the Chief of Staff should have been shown the door. It's not as if this is an unfair political witch hunt. Both of these financial transgressions are fairly black and white. Both made serious mistakes and both should have been made to face the consequences. I don't know what Jackie Trad has over Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk, and I don't know what factional fallout there could be from sidelining the Chief of Staff. But I do know that a Premier who's not in charge of events is hardly a leader. But if Premier Palaszczuk is just weak, Premier Gladys Berejiklian suffers from an even more debilitating condition, and that's a basic lack of political judgment. Like the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, Berejiklian spends far too much time pandering to people who'll never vote Liberal. Believe me, Liberal leaders doing Labor things might sometimes win plaudits from commentators, but it will never make them more electable. Lefty voters will always go for the real thing over the copycat, and that's one of the biggest problems with the Premier's insistence on legalising abortion up to the moment of birth for any reason, including sex selection. Let's go back to the start. First up, Berejiklian tried to rush the legislation through in record time. Then she pretended that the legislation was about decriminalising abortion, even though abortion to protect the physical and mental well-being of the mother has been lawful in New South Wales for 40+ years. And finally, she relied on Labor and the Greens to get through a bill that 2/3 of her own Liberal colleagues couldn't support. By asking the upper house belatedly to exclude sex selection abortion, and by now apparently agreeing to a government bill against third parties who harm an unborn baby, this is what she'll call Zoe's Law, the Premier has admitted there's a problem, but she hasn't fixed it. Instead, she's actually making a bad situation worse. The progressive left, Labor, the Greens and, weirdly enough, the National Party, they will humiliate her by voting down any last-minute amendments. They've already signalled as much, and Berejiklian, well, she can hardly condemn them because she herself voted against amendments that would have prohibited abortions based on sex selection in the lower house. Today, if news reports are to be believed, the Premier is trying to resurrect her standing by moving on Zoe's Law. But the idea that a drug-affected driver, for example, who harms an unborn baby should be a criminal under Zoe's Law, but that a doctor who harms one or lets one die if it's born alive is just doing their professional duty under the Greenwich Berejiklian abortion law, well, you only have to put those comments into words to see that the double standard is obvious. The trouble when Liberals try to be more politically progressive than Labor is that they often alienate Labor voters as much as they often alienate Liberal ones. The Galaxy polling conducted for the Australian Christian Lobby out today shows that Labor and Liberal voters have pretty much the same attitude to abortion, and what the majority of voters think, that's not what's in the Berejiklian bill. According to the poll, roughly 20% of people think abortion is always okay. Roughly 20% think it's never okay. And more than 50% of both Labor and Liberal voters think it should only be permitted up to 22 weeks of pregnancy, which is when an unborn baby with the right medical care can survive beyond the womb, when abortion is not so much terminating a pregnancy as it is ending the life of an unborn child. On sex selection abortions, as I said, supported by the Premier in the lower house 2 weeks ago, more than 80% of Labor and Liberal voters think that sex selection abortion should never be permitted. But here's the political lesson for progressive Liberals who think they can win over the Labor left. Sponsoring the most radical abortion legislation in the country hasn't helped Berejiklian's government with Labor voters, but it has made almost a third of Liberal voters less likely, according to the poll, to support her. You see, apart from appearing weak and unprincipled, Premier Palaszczuk hasn't done anything to upset her base. But in New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian hasn't just seemed weak, she's confused and dismayed her strongest supporters. And when good people have tried to explain that to her, all she's given them is lip service. This is why, just 5 months after winning the election, the Premier is now in real political trouble.